Good morning, everybody. Maybe we'll wait. Okay, here, there. Good morning, everybody, and we are all delighted that you're all here. We're very happy it's not raining. So this session actually, and let me give you a bit of history and who am I and who I'm representing. I'm Myra Buvinic, and I'm a senior fellow of the Center for Global Development and Data 2X. So I wear two hats, and in this meeting, I'm representing both. So both hats fit nicely into one. This meeting is co-sponsored by the Center for Global Development and Data 2X. Data 2X is a gender data initiative that is hosted at the United Nations Foundation. And this is actually the third of a series of meetings that we have done on measuring women's economic empowerment, at least empowerment. The first meeting we did, and it has also, both meetings have been co-sponsored by Data 2X and the Center for Global Development. The first one was in 2016, and it came about because we had been working on women's economic empowerment, and we had written a roadmap for promoting women's economic empowerment. And then came the question, well, but how do we measure women's economic empowerment? And the roadmap had said, well, we'll just look at the objective side of economic empowerment and measure productivity and earnings. And that's not that easy to do to begin with. But what about the subjective component, the empowerment? And that was, it's a big question. So we commissioned a number of thought pieces and reviews, and they are, I think, on the Data2X.org website, and I encourage you to look at them. And it was, how do researchers, should we go about in measuring this more subjective dimension? There's, among that series of papers, there's a very good review paper that Luis Fox and Carolina Romero did. So I encourage you to go and read them. And then one of the researchers that had presented at that first session, last year we had her here because she wrote an entire book, and it's Susana Martinez Restrepo, and wrote an entire book about measuring women's economic empowerment and how she felt that the measures that were being used did not work for women in South America. So we had a second meeting, and now I think we have the distinct pleasure to have a third meeting and to hear from Rachel Glenister, who is now the chief economist at DFID. She used to be the director of JPAL in the USA, and she will be presenting the guide that she and JPAL wrote on measuring empowerment. Let me just say two things. One is JPAL Indonesia. We have been working with JPAL Indonesia, and I have to say, you will hear more about it because as part of Center for Global Development, we are now doing 2 randomized controlled trials on women's access to mobile savings and the empowerment effects from that. And one is in Tanzania, and the other one is in Indonesia. In Indonesia, we have been working with JPAL Indonesia. They have been our field coordinators, and I have to say that they're amazing. And if you ever want to do research that is not in the USA, and you go to developing countries, definitely do work with JPAL because they really are incredible in the field. The other thing that I wanted to say is it's really nice to see that Rachel is now the chief economist at DFID. And I realized yesterday how much we have progressed in terms of the acceptance of issues of women's issues and gender issues in development, because now we have the chief economist at DFID writing about women's empowerment, and we have, in fact, the chief economist at USAID having done the same thing. So we have made a great progress. So with that, the floor is yours, Rachel.
Great, thanks. It's wonderful to be here and to talk about this issue. And what I want to do is introduce this new guide, which is about measuring not just economic empowerment for women, but empowerment more broadly for women. And it pulls on the research that has been done by many researchers doing impact evaluations, looking at gender issues. And so, first of all, I'm up here presenting it, but as I say, it's pulling on a wealth of a lot of innovation in this space across many, many, many researchers, but also particularly my co-authors, Claire and Lucia, who are here in the audience. Can you raise your hands, Claire? Claire in the front row, sorry. Did a huge amount of the work pulling together the lessons from across all these studies and are driving forward an ambitious agenda within JPAL on gender work with Seema Jayachandran. So I've moved on, but they're kind of pushing this very strongly. So let me start by, just stepping back, because when you talk about empowerment, it's there are many different definitions, and it's a complicated concept to get your head around, which is, of course, why we get so many measurement challenges. But these are the definitions that we pulled on most heavily when we're putting together the guide. And I think the things to recognize here is, it's a process, it's about agency, so it's not just about outcomes. And that's one of the things that makes it a challenge, and that's one of the things I want to really dig into. When we're reading about this and reading about, what people have discussed as the challenges, people have said, well, it's, empowerment is a process and it's about change, and so, it's impossible to quantify. And my reaction is, no, it's just hard. That doesn't mean it's impossible to quantify. It makes it hard to quantify, but yes, it's about agency. Yes, it's about change, but that doesn't mean that we can't quantify it. So this guide is really about, if you take seriously that empowerment is about what women want, and what women and how their lives are changing and how involved they are in making decisions, not just that they're better off at the end, but they were involved in that process. That doesn't mean that you can't quantify it, so how do we go about quantifying it? So what are the challenges? So there are many, as I say. One that makes it hard to measure is that as I say, empowerment is about a meaningful choice. But we rarely observe decision-making directly. Now, I'm going to give you some examples where you can actually observe decision-making directly, but you often don't. So it's also a process. So it's not just about where you end up, but how did you get there? And the area that I think has been discussed in a lot of the literature about measuring women's empowerment is the problem of social desirability bias and reporting bias. And this is just fundamental to all the work we do. You want to hear from women, you want to hear the voice of women, you want to understand what they care about, but you've also got to worry about the fact that what they say to you is very much influenced by what they think you want to hear. And that's just it's just a huge problem in this area. So we'll talk a bit about what you can do to try and address that. Empowerment means different things in different contexts. And I think, that's always true. We always have to worry about context, but it's particularly true in this area. And that is because the constraints that women face are different in different places. So and also what they want to see change is different in different places. So if you take seriously that this is about what women want and the constraints they face, then you have to tailor what you do to what are the constraints that they face in this given context. So we'll come back to the fact that we also want to compare across, and that's the real challenge. So you want to tailor things to understand what are the constraints that women face, but you also want to be able to compare across studies, and that's where things get, quite difficult. There are many, many aspects of empowerment, and so you can end up with, 300 measures of empowerment, and then how do you prioritize? That's something that you come across when you're looking at social capital and many other concepts, related concepts, but it's certainly true in the empowerment space. Again, a really hard thing, there's this trade-off between taking very seriously what women want to change in their environment and the fact that they may have internalized constraints within society. So they may not ask for things because they think it's impossible, or they may have, internalized a view that women can't do certain things. So that's a challenge, and it's very related to the problem that you have in behavioral economics, which is that, about preferences changing over time. So if you want to measure, well, this is what you want to do, and then at the end, are people doing what they said that they wanted to be able to do at the beginning? Well, how do you account for the fact that preferences change? So standard economics assumes that you have a standard, you have a set of preferences and those don't change, whereas actually we know that an intervention may change preferences, and that's just ambiguous. The welfare effects of that are really ambiguous in economics. So. And finally, disempowerment can heighten the problems of data collection challenges, and I will talk about some very specific examples that I've faced in my work on that. So that's the problem. The guide is trying to help you think through these challenges. It's not like we have simple answers to all of these, but it's really meant to present some of the things that researchers have done and share the wisdom and the experiences that people have found in trying to address these challenges as they've worked. So it's really designed to be for people doing monitoring and evaluation work in the field in the developing countries. So there's many other things that other reasons you may want to measure women's empowerment, but this is designed for people primarily doing impact evaluations. Although a number of people have said it's useful outside that context, but that was our main goal. It draws on diverse discipline and also on a huge amount of experience from JPAL and other professors and researchers. We don't give you a ready-to-go instrument. Like, this is it, you just take it and apply that. That's the whole concept of this guide is, that's not how it works, guys. We can't tell you here, what's going to be relevant to your impact evaluation somewhere else. But we can tell you some, steps that you might want to go through to get there. So, we talk about the process that you would need to get to somewhere, and then give you a bunch of examples about how to do it, and some tips for overcoming challenges. And then a nice kind of companion piece that you can find is just a whole collection of survey instruments that have been used that you can pick from and test in the field in your context and think about. So what's the strategy? What are the steps that you might want to go through? This is basically the steps you should go through for any impact evaluation, designing instruments. So, but I think it's maybe particularly relevant given the challenges in this space. And you start with formative research. In other words, understanding what the gender issues are in the context where you're trying to do a study. And this is hugely important. And I think it's really, really important to say that quantitative researchers do this a lot, and then they feel quite embarrassed about talking about it, or there's certainly no space to talk about it in their paper. So if you read a paper in Econometrica or AR or whatever, they are not going to talk about that first step where they spent, many months or, over the years, learned a lot about and asked a lot of questions and spent a lot of time talking to people in the field and understanding their problems and the institutional issues around it. just because in the economics papers there's no place to put that. It doesn't mean, and a number of people have said to us, you know, when you don't talk about that, people think that they can go in and do what you're doing without doing that step. So part of this is just to say, to write down somewhere, actually, this is really important. It's really important to doing a good impact evaluation, that first step of really understanding context. And in particular, so that's relevant for all impact evaluations. For gender, what does that mean? It means, as I said in the introduction, it means understanding what women feel about what they would like to do that they can't do now. It means talking to people about, you know, when we worked when we kicked off the work on our Bangladesh study, we asked many different kinds of people, what does an empowered girl look like that's different from an unempowered girl? And, you know, people came up with many dimensions, and that wasn't just, you know, that was sort of designed in this context. What's realistic in this context for a girl to do, an empowered girl to do? So it's not like a completely hypothetical thing of, you know, what's different from a Bangladesh girl from a girl in the US. It's in this context, what does an empowered girl look like? What does she do differently? What can she do? What does she do differently? And we asked that of, as I say, many different people. Then, as I say, the other steps are kind of really important, but are there for every study. You want to map the theory of change and outcomes to indicators, develop you know, instruments that make sense, test them in the field, really important. You know, subtle changes in words can get you very different outcomes. So you need to understand what people mean, you know, what people understand by language that you're using locally. And then a data collection plan, which is, again, really important and different when you're talking about gender, particularly when you're trying to get at marginalized groups who, you know, who won't talk if you send in a man. You know, you won't be allowed in to talk to an adolescent girl in Bangladesh if you send in a male enumerator. It's about the time of day that women might have to be able to talk to you. If you're, you know, you might think doing adolescent girls is hard, but, you know, try young married women. I'm sure a lot of you have had that experience. They are so overwhelmed with work, and it's not up to them where they have the time to talk to you. Somebody else is going to make that decision. So at least finding the right time of day when they might have a bit more time is important. So I want to talk a bit about some lessons. First of all, just let me talk about this framework. So we use this approach that Kabir's approach of sort of resources, agencies, and achievements, which is a kind of standard framework for thinking about empowerment. And then if you okay. Then I think, you know, here's an example of how we kind of then split that up into the different steps along the process. So in resources, you can think about knowledge and preferences, and then access and agency. You're talking about negotiation, decision making, and then so this was an example of when we were trying to do this in Bangladesh, and we were looking at an impact evaluation that was looking at changing age of marriage, and also then you know, ability to stay on in school and reproductive health outcomes. So those were the objectives of the study that we were looking at. And so we first wanted to see, did the intervention change people's knowledge about the risks of child marriage, about you know, what contraception was available. Then we wanted to look on you know, the next step along the theory of change would be, okay, you know, the first step is do they know things? Then the next step is, did they change what they wanted? And then finally, it's kind of, were they able to actually change their outcomes? So this is sort of examples of how you do that, you know, working through the theory of change. So, you know, Did they know different forms of how many different forms of contraception did they know? Then preferences about preferred number of children and spacing, and then did they actually use contraception? So you kind of, getting an indicator at each step along the way, and then that helps you if there isn't a final change to see where in the theory of change it broke down. And agency, that's about the process again, trying to get at the process by which this happened, and I'll come back to some other ways of getting sort of more directly at decision making. And then finally, that the achievements, the outcomes of child marriage rate and reproductive health. So here are some examples of some of the challenges that I've met along the way. And here's an example about the importance of formative research. So what can formative research help us with? As I say, this is, you start kind of, quantitative people start getting uncomfortable about this, but this is work that we do all the time. But so what do we do in this process? Well, what can it help us do? So understanding women's and girls' choices, as I say, are going to be constrained differently. What you can do is going to be different in different contexts. One of the things that really struck us when we were trying to do work on mobility in Bangladesh, so everyone, when we asked them about what's the challenge in Bangladesh, what does an empowered girl look like, mobility just comes up again and again and again. Like, can women get to where they want to go? Are they constrained to stay within the house? Do they have to wait for someone else to go with them? And so we clearly thought, well, we've got to ask questions about mobility, and our initial naive assumption was it's about distance, right? An unempowered girl can only move us in a small circle, and an empowered girl can move in a wider circle. And after many discussions, it became really apparent to us that it's not just about how far she can go, it's about for what. So she can go places, further away places, for people say, well, I can't go outside the house without having someone go with me. And then you ask about if she's going to school. Yes. Well, does your family have to walk you to school? Oh no, I can walk to school on my own. So yes, she's constrained for doing some things, but she's allowed to walk to school. So it really depends on what she's doing. The mobility is really dependent on what she's doing. She couldn't go to that same location if it wasn't for education. And so those are the kind of subtleties that you pick up when you spend time doing that formative research. So in the end, our survey questions are really quite complicated. They're about, where can you go for what? And in particular, what it became clear was what girls couldn't do was travel for something that was important only to them, right? They could do things that were important for other people or were seen as sort of a public good, but something that was just frivolous for fun, that they couldn't do. And that's the essence of empowerment, is being able to do something for yourself. So I think when we think about more mobility, we've got to think about it differently as mobility to do something for other people versus mobility to do something just for the women. Like, that's the essence of empowerment for me. Generating a theory of change, spending time talking to people about the marriage market in Bangladesh completely changed my view about what were the constraints. So, parents seem to understand the challenges of early marriage. They seem to, recognize that there were health issues. But how they talked about the marriage process, for me, suddenly triggered in my mind, okay, this is a search model. This is something that, takes a long time. There's a lot of signaling. There's a lot of quality issues. And it kind of set me off thinking about different economic models than if I hadn't been having all of those conversations. And that's one of the constraints, I think, in working on qualitative work, if you just kind of delegate it to a qualitative researcher, is a lot of the lessons that I learned from those qualitative interviews resonated differently with me. Like, I work very closely with Shahana Nazneen, who's a doctor in qualitative researcher in Bangladesh. But what she takes from a conversation isn't always what I take, because we're trained in different disciplines. And so where I think, oh, search model, that's not what immediately comes to mind for her. So I think I'll move on, but I could talk forever about kind of the examples of the importance of this formative step. I want to talk a little bit about decision making and how difficult it is. What are the challenges of measuring, as we say? If we're talking about agency, it's about that process of decision making. And the standard questions in the DHS are kind of, who makes decisions on health? The wife, the husband, or do you do it jointly? But as we heard, there's there was a whole book written about the challenges of some of those questions. So what do? I think what you do is you try and combine different ways of asking about decision making and try and build up a picture from that. So, you can ask people specifically about the process, as in the DHS. Do you make decisions about this? You can measure men's and women's preferences and then see what the end up result is. Is it something that men? So if you look at Esther's paper on the importance of quotas in India. What they do there is they ask men and women what they would prefer money to be spent on, and then they see after that you have political quotas for women, you see a shift towards the things that women care about. So that's more of an outcome way of seeing that they were involved in the decision. You can use psychological measures to look at agency, whether women, are recorded on these kind of psychological measures as feeling like they have agency. And you can try and observe directly a decision being made. And I want to talk a little bit about that process of doing that, because that's, for me, I think, my favorite way of measuring decision making. But here's just an example of where our standard decision-making questions might have problems. So, as I say, the standard question about decision-making in the DHS is, who makes decisions about health? You, your husband, or jointly? Or are they made jointly? And this kind of fails the basic standard for a question that I could answer it. So I couldn't answer that question. I mean, it depends, like what health decision? Like if my kid was having surgery, I would absolutely do it jointly with my husband. That doesn't mean I'm not empowered, like it's a big decision, we want to do it together. If it was, can I buy an aspirin? I don't have to ask my husband, but if, we wouldn't do it jointly, I'd just go out and buy it. So I can't answer that question about who in my household decides on health decisions. So we tried asking more specific questions. And I also think that these specific questions are really important in addressing social desirability bias, because if you ask things generally, you may kick off, what do people want me to say? Whereas if you ask something specific, like, a general question of, do you think it's as important for girls to go to school as boys? Like everyone will say, yes, of course. And then you actually look at the data and the girls aren't going. Well, but if you ask who went to school yesterday, people are much less likely to make up the answer because of what they want you to, what they think you want to hear. So, more specific questions, which is what we asked in Bangladesh, what we ended up with in Bangladesh is, if your child is sick and needs immediate healthcare, but your husband isn't home, what would you do? And people can kind of really visualize that. That's happened to them before, and they know. So I think you're less likely to get problems of social desirability bias. Also, I kind of can interpret the answer, like I know what that means. In terms of whether a woman can't take a sick child to the clinic. remember, that's about helping other people. You're helping the kid, so maybe she's empowered to be able to do it for the sake of the kid. What about herself? So I think it's really important to ask that version of the question, but about the woman herself. Can she fix her own healthcare on her own? So we also asked, if you need medicine, do you have money now to go and get medicine now for yourself? Turns out that the answers you get are not very well correlated between those two questions, those two ways of asking that question. We did an analysis, and many people say they're not empowered on terms of the general question, but they can do those specific things, and vice versa. People who said they couldn't do the specific things said that they were empowered on the first. So, that's just a caution about how the problem is, if you ask these questions, you won't be able to relate your study to other people's, because other people are always asking the top question. I actually think those two specific questions are pretty relevant for most contexts where women aren't empowered. So I'd actually like more people to use those specific questions. So I got 5 minutes left, and I just want to talk about non-survey instruments for a bit, because I think this is a really important way of getting around social desirability bias. And you literally can observe people making decisions if you do non-survey instruments. So, they're less prone to reporting bias, and they reveal attitudes that people themselves may not be aware of, I think, which is absolutely critical. So I'm going to talk about an example from a community-driven development program that we did in Sierra Leone. And we call this method a structured community assessment. That's what we call it, SCA. And it is, so what we did in this case is we wanted to observe a community making a decision. The point of one of the big objectives of community-driven development, where you give a community some money and then you ask, you require them to have an inclusive process for working on that money. So, women have to be involved in the decision making for that money. And the objective is that that will spill over to other decisions that are made in the community. So that's the program. So we kind of wanted to replicate that in the study at the end to see whether that had an effect. Did these communities include the voice of women in the decisions that they made? Well, how are we going to see a decision being made? Well, we went and asked them to make a decision, right? So we went to these communities. We were doing a big survey. We said, we're going to take a lot of your time, everybody in the community's time over the next couple of days, asking lots of surveys. We'd like to compensate the community for that time. So we'd like to give the community a gift. We have 2 gifts in the back of the truck, and we'd like to know which one you would like. We have salt and batteries. 2 things that, again, lots of formative research suggested these communities would like. And then we step back, not we, obviously, I wasn't there. It was a bunch of extremely well-trained, brilliant enumerators, Sierra Leonean enumerators who did this. They stepped back and observed what happened next. Did the chief just say, which they did in, I think, about a third of the cases, oh, we'll have the salt, thank you very much? Or did, after 4 years of being trained to be inclusive, did they call a meeting? In fact, in our early work in testing this out, we found that so many chiefs just decided on the spot that we prompted it to be even more likely to be inclusive by saying, can you call together a meeting of the community, which they do all the time in Sierra Leone, they have methods for doing this. They called to the community meeting and said, we're having this, we're going to do this survey. We'd like to give you a gift. Which gift would you like? Even then, a third of the chiefs said, with their entire population in front of them, easy to ask, they said, we'll have the salt, please. And exactly the same number of them did that in the community-driven development and in the not. the not CDD villages. But then when there was a discussion, we could see, were women involved? How many women spoke up? How long did they speak for? So you could get really rich quantitative data on the actual decision-making process by prompting them to make a decision. Now I have a number of other examples here, and there are a ton in the guide about these kind of non-survey instruments, which I think are really really useful. Being able to say, we could rule out that even one more woman spoke in these villages where you just spent 4 years persuading them that you needed to listen to women. That was a pretty good indicator that actually women's voice hadn't changed in these communities. So as I say, there are many more in this vignettes and others, but I want to conclude and get on to the discussion. I won't actually even go over the conclusion slide. So thank you very much.
Kate, go ahead. So we have really 5 people here. There are only 4 present, but one about to be.
One on the way.
And we are delighted that Kate came today. So, I told you that if you wanted to work in Indonesia and do an RCT in Indonesia, you had to work with JPAL. If you want to work in Tanzania, you need to work definitely, and in other places, not only in Tanzania, with TechnoServe and the World Bank Gender Innovation Lab, the Africa Gender Innovation Lab. So, inviting both Kate Diaz, she is the Director of Impact Evaluation at TechnoServe, and TechnoServe is an NGO. You will tell a bit about what TechnoServe is. João Montalvão, he is an economist at the Africa Gender Innovation Lab at the World Bank. I had said, we are doing a piece of research, an RCT in Indonesia, and we are doing also a very similar one, looking at mobile savings for women in Tanzania. TechnoServe is the implementing agency that is doing the training of the women who are getting the mobile savings and the business management training. The Africa Gender Innovation Lab is doing the impact evaluation. So with that, I will turn on, and Rachel, this is a great guide. And obviously, I think the basic point is this is how you do good research for anything, not only for women's empowerment. So it's really great. So João, let me start with you and sort of very briefly tell us a bit about how you went about doing the research in Tanzania. And João now has some results, and these are very, very of the end lines. So then we can talk a bit about the results.
Sounds good. So in Tanzania, the goal of this project was to help women micro-entrepreneurs expand their businesses. So this formative research that Rachel was talking about involved a lot of fieldwork. Actually, it was mostly led by TechnoServe, as well as a review of the literature of the lessons on related impact evaluations on the topic. And some of the hypotheses that this preliminary work delivered, the first one was that women, one of the constraints that they were facing to grow their businesses was lack of a private, secure, and practical way to save. And the theory is that savings help businesses make investments and cope with unexpected shocks. But we also, this work also told us that perhaps women in this context face multiple constraints that can exacerbate each other. So in addition to lack of ability to save, we hypothesized based on this work that perhaps without the skill, without the ambition, without the mindset to want to grow their businesses and the technical skills to do that, just providing women with access to savings with a savings product could not be enough. So, this leads us to the theory of change. We expected that by relaxing both access to savings and business skills, we could have a much larger impact than just relaxing one of the constraints. So, and I think the point what I want to make here is that in order to measure empowerment I don't think, it's my personal view perhaps, but it's not one question or a set of indicators or an index. It's actually a measurement system. So you map out this theory of change where you relax constraints here, and then you have several pathways that will lead to your ultimate desired outcomes, growing business, welfare impacts, whatever it is. And then you need to build indicators throughout these entire causal paths. And empowerment would be a change, a systematic change throughout this entire system. And I can talk a little bit about the results if you want now or later.
Tell us very briefly some of the empowerment results. Are there any?
Yeah. So another advantage that we have with this study is that we have actual data on women's savings on the mobile savings product. So it goes back to this idea that you sometimes need to actually observe behaviors. It's very difficult to ask to obtain truthful responses on whether people save or not. So this is an advantage of this study. But what we observe is that indeed there seemed to be a demand for the products. Providing women with access to this mobile savings product increased the usage of the product. Take-up was relatively high compared to other studies. But this did not translate ultimately into systematic impacts on downstream outcomes, business level outcomes. But we did find that supplementing the mobile savings accounts with business training really led to some meaningful impacts on business outcomes. They opened more accounts, they opened more businesses, they developed new products, they invested in capital, in labor, and we are hopefully that ultimately this will lead to increased earnings and profits in the longer term. These are short, medium-term impacts. And we also observe it's very difficult to measure agency. It's almost a metaphysical concept. How do I know what are my values and my goals? Psychologists will tell you that this is a learning phenomena, it's introspective phenomena. But anyway, so with that caveat, we measure women's ability to their decision-making power over the money that they generate from their businesses vis-a-vis their husbands, and we observe large increases on that variable, which is in line with this theory of change that mobile savings gives you a private way to save money. You can shield it from social pressures, namely from perhaps your husband.
Great, thank you. Kate, tell us first sort of how does TechnoServe, very briefly what TechnoServe is and how does TechnoServe measure impact?
Sure. TechnoServe is a nonprofit organization working in 29 countries around the world. And our focus is on increasing revenues or financial benefits for the people that we work with. We work across a number of different value chains in the agricultural sector, and we also work with small and medium enterprises to help them increase their revenues and, as a result, reduce poverty around the world. And we have actually an annual impact measurement initiative in which we report internally our own impact and aggregate it up across all of our projects. And that captures information on the additional revenue we've generated, the number of people we think have actually seen that revenue in their pockets, the finance that we've helped to catalyze in the markets that we're working with, and a new indicator as of last year, which is the number of women that we've worked with in our work. And it was a really important achievement for us to disaggregate the women reached as its own unique indicator in our impact measurement efforts. But as soon as we did that, and even as we were doing it, we knew that that's not enough, right? We knew that actually working with women is not the same as empowering women, is not the same as ensuring that they actually have more control over their money, and ability to invest it in things that are important to them and them alone. So as soon as the impact report was out this year, we started talking with the gender team about, okay, well, what do we do? How do we start to measure women's empowerment across our portfolio? and think about introducing that, maybe in the medium term, not immediately, but how do we introduce that into our global metrics approach? And I would just want to say that this toolkit is really an important opportunity for us to really dig into how do we do that, because initially it was just a bit daunting to figure out what is the standard metric for measuring women's empowerment. And the toolkit says, maybe don't think of it like that, right? Which is in and of itself a great and important understanding and nuance to acknowledge for ourselves. And then how do we break it down across projects to understand how to measure impact or our empowerment effect in projects? And that is another area. While we have this kind of global reporting structure, inside each of our own projects, we're measuring our own set of indicators. They're tailored to the context. And practitioners like TechnoServe have a bit of a hard road to hoe. We are expected to be experts in implementation, but we also should have a unit that has pretty deep knowledge about measurement. But our unit, the one that I lead, while we have deep knowledge about measurement, we do have to be generalists across the countries that we're working in, the commodities that we're working in, the sectors. And so that means that for a topic such as gender, which is so nuanced and so challenging to really get at what we know to be truth, it's easy to push it off the table. It's easy to question whether we have the right set of tools to really measure effectively what we're doing. And so having this guide really democratizes the deep knowledge that you all bring to this space and helps us who are generalists take it on with a little bit more confidence to know that we can get at certain aspects and know how to hone in on the aspects that we really think are having impact. And I can go into some details and some examples, but I'll stop there for now.
That's great, thank you. So you are now starting to do, I think, what the guide and what Rachel says in the guide, that we should always consider gender, even when the program does not target gender. Rachel, can you sort of expand a bit on that?
Right. So there are a number of reasons why I think it's important to think about gender in measurement, even and obviously also in program design, even when it's not, front and center of what a program is doing. The most obvious reason is you might have unintended consequences, and we've seen that again and again in development, where something is introduced and it has a negative impact on women that wasn't anticipated. I would also say in the context of TechnoServe, ruling out that there weren't unintended consequences, because I was in many debates. I've worked with TechnoServe over the years and talked to them about impact evaluation in their work and in agriculture generally. And one of the things that they face is an assumption that if you work on cash crops, it's going to hurt women. Right? And that, they got a lot of pushback from some funders saying, well, we don't want you to work on cash crops because it'll hurt women. And we were like, maybe, maybe not. Can we investigate that? So that's an example where they kind of, you might want to look at the gender impacts to test whether that, whether it is true that there's this unintended consequence, and that it's, you might even end up refuting that there is an unintended consequence that people just assume that is there. So, we really have to be careful about making these assumptions either way on the impact of gender. The other thing is, at the simplest level of disaggregation, it really struck me when I was working on a review of the education work, impact evaluations, that, there's a lot of assumption that you need to, women are behind in education in many countries, so you have to have programs that are designed specifically to address women. But when we looked at the data disaggregated for impact evaluations that had worked on getting kids in school, it really struck us that even the programs that weren't, helped all communities, men and women in education, they actually, most of them had their biggest impact on women. So, so I guess I'm giving you two examples of where even thinking about gender, even though it had similar effects on men and women, it was still helpful to understand what the gender impacts of that were. And sometimes it means you don't actually have to design things differently, but you can't know that unless you've actually looked at the question. And so it's important to understand whether on unintended consequences, who's gaining most, and whether you need a specifically tailored gendered program. And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't, but you don't know the answer to that question unless you ask the question.
Right. This is, what a data to X is the mantra, sex disaggregate your data.
And the crazy thing is, I don't know a survey that doesn't ask gender. I've never seen a survey that doesn't ask gender, and yet you see all these studies that don't report it, or they report it in the appendix, and then when people do the meta-analysis, they don't pull it out. So there's actually a lot of data there if we could just get people to release it a bit more, or study the disaggregation.
There's a very famous study that I will not say the authors, and it was a sort of business training, entrepreneurship, whatever. 90% of the sample were women. Gender was not mentioned at all, was not, anyway. But I think, one of the issues, though, is if you sex disaggregate it, it costs more, right? Sometimes you have to have larger samples. And that, that can be, anyway. Joao, sort of going back, one of the things that Rachel sort of mentions in the guide is this issue of sort of how you tackle social desirability. But there's, the bias, sort of people responding to socially desirable things. Like, you go to a village and you ask women, what do you want to do? Oh, I'm a housewife, yes, and I love being a housewife. And, or, I want, if income generation, I want to do sewing and knitting. It would never occur to them something that is non-traditional, but that they may want to do. But anyway, but there's the other side of interviewer bias. Mm-hmm. We have blinders many times, and many times sort of questions are designed with biases. I mean, labor force surveys being a traditional one, or or interviewers in their interviewing may bias their responses. And I think that the Gender Innovation Lab, tell us a bit what then the Gender Innovation Lab has done.
So actually, this is an interesting question because we just completed this study where we are, there is this large literature that shows that, the characteristics, the identity of the enumerators affect lead to social desirability bias types of responses. So what we did in this study, we were trying to understand what are the characteristics of the enumerators that affect girls' responses on sensitive questions about their sexual behaviors. And so these are adolescent girls in Liberia. And one of the things that I find super interesting that we found is that not only, and these are well-trained enumerators, not only easily observable characteristics of the enumerators, such as gender, looks, age, but harder to observe characteristics such as attitudes, their values, affect girls' responses. We found, for example, that girls were less likely to report having had sex if they were being interviewed by enumerators with traditional views about gender. And we also found, even though the respondents were told that this was done in the context of an impact evaluation during the baseline survey of a mentorship program. So we also found, even though we told respondent girls that their responses would not affect their participation, we found that enumerators that were more passionate about the program elicited different types of responses from the girls. So I don't know, this could it's likely through nonverbal communication, changes in gaze, intonation, the way they ask the questions. Girls perceive that. and affects the response. So the solution to this, I really don't know, but it could be, the easy, not very creative ways in your analysis. Well, before that, you can randomize enumerators across respondents. Sometimes that's not optimal from a logistical perspective, so at the very least, you should control for the identity of the enumerator in your regression analysis. But more creative ways entail the use of these anchoring vignettes and list experiments for sensitive questions. Anyway, I'll stop at that.
There are sort of two issues, I think, that the guide and Rachel has mentioned, and I want to ask big issues. One is this, everything is, some things are context specific, so you have to do questions, but then you want to generalize and standardize. That's one big question. The other big question is, all this requires a lot of work, is very time intensive, while on the other hand, simple questions, easy questions are probably best in terms of responses. So how do we balance these two major issues? For you, Kate, I mean, you were saying that you have to draw standard answers to describe the global programs, but then, you have very different locations and very different programs. How do you, as the impact evaluator at TechnoServe, how do you manage this?
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge, and as I mentioned, we haven't actually done it yet for women's empowerment. So quickly drawing some lessons from other areas where we have done more work on standardizing around increases in revenues. Sometimes it means representing a project's impact in a way that is perhaps, to the project's perspective, not fully capturing their full impact. And that goes to, Rachel, your comments earlier on the top question, the standard question from DHS is perhaps it helps to get at an idea and allows you to compare across in a fairly consistent way. But in order to dig deeper and understand more, we absolutely have to have a much stronger framework that is tailored to the project itself. And while yes, it's more time consuming, I think that it's an important call out to say that time that we take in the formative research not only affects our ability to do a strong impact evaluation, it affects our ability to do a good project. Yep. When we did some work we're currently undertaking a project in the Mijang forest region in Ethiopia. And before we actually went out and finalized our approach to our implementation, we were working in the coffee and honey value chains in this fairly biodiverse area of Ethiopia. We wanted to know how women would be able to interact with our project and able to reap some benefits from our project, that it didn't all accrue to men. And we learned that we had some hypotheses. We knew that it would be hard for women to travel deep into the forest where the coffee trees and the honey hives are. So we thought that would be a constraint to incorporating them. But we found during some of our research that, in fact, a larger constraint was the amount of drudgery work that they had to do in pounding maize, in carrying water, in doing all these other responsibilities, reproductive responsibilities of the household that were limiting their ability to actually engage in the productive and income-earning activities. And so as a result of that research, we modified our implementation approach to also focus on revamping some maize mills that are in the area so that more of the maize could be shipped off to the mills. Like 24 hours a week of time per woman could be saved to do other things. And hopefully, other things that they would have more control over and decision-making authority over how they spend their time doing that. Hopefully some of that would be in income production, but that's their choice. And so that has shifted how we're doing our project, and ultimately, we believe shifts how much impact we'll have in the project, both from a women's empowerment perspective, but also from an income generation perspective.
All right. Rachel, Oriana Bandiera said once, and I think it's in one of our reports, that her guidance, methodological guidance, was questionnaires should be numerical, easy, short, and consistent. how do you balance that with, what the guide is really asking, which is very labor-intensive, time-intensive, expensive research?
So I guess one of the things I would say is it's time-intensive and labor-intensive to get a short questionnaire. So a lot of this work that you do up front is to get rid of the questions that aren't going to help you. And so finding that specific, clear, short, numeric question that captures the essence of, the most important aspect for women, or combined with what the project is actually working on, I think it is intensive and hard work to do, but if you do your work well, that helps you hone in on, the question that's going to be really helpful in this context. Some of the some of the non-survey instruments, like the choice experiment that we did in Sierra Leone, it doesn't suffer from the problem of people don't want to sit there answering questions for a long time, because they're not answering questions, you're just observing them. So that helps a little bit in that. Now it's not a short survey, but you're not you're not asking them questions. So there's sometimes a bit of a trade-off there, in that non-survey ones can actually relieve the constraint on the person you're interviewing. Not always, but sometimes. I just wanted to come back to this point about this formative work is important and time-consuming, but it's really beneficial to do it with the implementation team. So it's not just an investment in asking a good survey question, it's an investment in designing the project. And it's just so much better to do your formative work with the implementer. So you're really co-producing the intervention and co-producing the survey and the research design at the same time, because what you're learning about the constraints for women is really important for designing the intervention and for the research. So that's, again, some saving of time in a sense, but it also helps produce that bond between the researcher and implementer that is absolutely crucial to good work.
I want to ask a question of the three of you, and it's sort of more a conceptual question. It used to be that we never talked about women's economic empowerment or women's empowerment. You would talk about income generation projects for women, women's labor force participation. Now everybody talks about empowerment, women's economic empowerment, implementers, researchers, we want to measure. Are we overusing it, or there's a lot of surplus meaning to the concept of empowerment? Wouldn't it be better for us to just stick to the objective measures? What is the added value of the concept? Rachel, you start.
So I think the added value is it's not just about getting an outcome that other people might want women to do, right? So if you just say, well, if women are earning more, that's a good thing. For who? Like, it's not necessarily a good thing for the women. And what we care about is, and I say this in many contexts, we don't care about empowerment because it produces more income. We care about income because it produces more empowerment. I mean, it's about, or more, life well-being. Like that's the objective of everything that we do is improving people's lives, not improving people's incomes. Now, income may be a really good way to produce an improved life, but what you actually care about at the end of the day is a better life. And so I think that's particularly true when you think about this drudgery work or how women respond to reducing time. Sometimes you relieve women's time constraint and they don't go off and earn more income. Well, that maybe because they don't, they're actually working quite hard at the moment, thank you very much, and they value some leisure. There's this study in Morocco where, you made it easier for women to access water, and people were hoping they'd go out and earn more money, and they spent more time talking to their friends. Great, fine, that's fine as an outcome, they're happier. So that's why we shouldn't only look at kind of income or some of these outcome measures. We also want to look at whether women actually want that outcome.
So I don't know. I mean, if overusage leads to more resources and effort towards empowering women, I don't think that's a bad thing. What I think sometimes is not so much overusage, but misusage. Defining very well what we mean by empowerment is crucial in order to quantify it, and Rachel just speak to that. So it's more about I think it's great people use it a lot, but it's also important that they define it very clearly.
Kate, that question plus the addition, will it benefit TechnoServe to start talking about women's economic empowerment?
Oh yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, I think part of what was helpful about the toolkit, again, is that it reinforces that empowerment is part of a theory of change that we need to take into consideration if our end goal is to reduce poverty and increase incomes. So the discussion about the agency and the process and the ultimate outcomes and the achievements of empowerment, if achievements is increased access to income and control over that income by women, understanding that you have to align the agency and go through the kind of process of empowering women, getting that down, understanding that process, and not just pointing ourselves at that final outcome and thinking, well, why didn't we achieve it? That's critical. So measuring empowerment is, in fact, the way that we're going to achieve our mission, because we are better able to identify what we're missing and what the stages are that we have to get to empower women to actually reach higher incomes.
Okay, we are going to turn to the audience. I think I have many more questions, but and have you asked questions of the speaker. So please identify yourself and try to be as brief as possible. We'll take 2 or 3 questions and then turn to the speakers. Go ahead, who has the microphone? You can start.
So my name is Chin, and I'm the founder of 4 Girls Global Leadership, and I'm thrilled for this event. In fact, I flew in from Europe where I was speaking because it's what I do. And in fact, it's my understanding that I did the first ever global survey on young women's empowerment. I focused on millennials, and because it was global, what we learned is, first, the word empowerment doesn't exist in any language but English, which is a telltale sign. So we didn't use even the word empowerment, and we measured agency. And we found from our data there were 2 very strong indicators of how young women today empowered. And it didn't matter if it was United States or Afghanistan, it was consistent. So I have so many, clearly I want to get to the question, is that I think we need to be very clear, and I hope this is only the beginning of many other conversations about women's empowerment, because it is that nebulous word. Everyone from sports industry to development is using the word women's empowerment without not even knowing what that means. And I do believe, though, we need to look at other sectors who are doing it. I noticed that the survey was from DHS, and my former boss was the Secretary of Health, so I know there's many behavioral change surveys that you look at to see, is it changing behavior? Is it changing their action? And so can we partner with other sectors and other social sectors with surveys that have already been in existence? I mean, I think that if development sector could adopt those behavioral change surveys, that we would also make, huge wave and progress. Because I don't actually think, in this sector, I know it's called women's or gender equality and women's empowerment. There's no gender equality. We've hit the ceiling. Until we know whether women and girls are empowered, we won't ever achieve gender equality.
So you don't have a question, I guess, but it's partnering. Using other. Okay. Let's take another 2 or 3 questions and then
Hi.
we'll go.
I Sung from Save the Children. Hi, Rachel. Quick question. We've been using everything you've talked about, how to create better instruments for surveying and menstrual hygiene piece. But just like you talked about, the context is so important, but we do need to go across the globe, like trying to get a better indicator that we can measure across. Any shortcuts on taking a really intensive method? Again, we've been doing this with menstrual hygiene and we've been getting great results, but everybody wants to know, how can we use it elsewhere, not just where you've developed it in your impact area? And so, any shortcuts?
Okay, great. Let's take a couple more questions and then we'll.
Hi. Oh, Mary Beth Hastings with Iris Group. Thank you so much for these presentations and questions and discussion. I was given that so many constraints to women's decision making and girls' decision making are structural and in policies embedded in institutions. It was interesting to see that there wasn't there hasn't really been a focus on the power of collective action as a measure of empowerment. To what extent are we thinking through collective that power with other women and girls to be able to change the environments around them to make them work for their decision-making power?
Thank you. And let's take one more and then we'll go back to the.
Hi, I'm Varun Gori from Embed, which is the behavioral science team at the World Bank. Rachel, I'm very much a fan of this work, but I wanted to get your thoughts on an alternative or perhaps complementary approach. Because empowerment is very hard to measure for the reasons you described, what about an approach that measures the predictable constraints to empowerment, which would be laws, social norms, and strategies of control? So we have the work from Women, Business, and the Law that measures laws. Our team and others are doing work to measure gender norms directly. I don't know any work that directly assesses the strategies of control that the men around women, husbands, others, use to keep them, in place, so to speak. But this would be to sort of, we know these things limit agency and empowerment, so maybe we could sort of measure those regularly and see if they change over time.
Okay, so we have a question on other, behavioral measures that are being used. Can we use those? We have a question on shortcuts, on how do we measure collective empowerment, and how do we measure these other predictable constraints that are not directly. We start, Joao, you want to start with?
So there was a question about a standardized tool to use across different countries, contexts, I guess. So again, I think I share the view of this panel that those tools are useful, but only to a certain extent. They allow for comparability of impacts of different interventions across different populations and different contexts, but you really need to complement, enrich those tools with tailored questions to the specific intervention. But anyway, so actually, where I work, the Gender Innovation Lab, we are trying to use a standardized tool across all our different interventions to measure empowerment. And it comprises about 10 or 11 questions. And actually, my colleague Alicia Donald, which is leading that work, she's here, and then I'm sure she'll be happy to talk with you about that at the end.
Great. Rachel.
Yeah, so let me first say, because I really prompted myself to say it and didn't, I talked a lot about the Bangladesh study here, which is a long-term collaboration with Save the Children. And, my hat's off to them for this, long partnership. And, some of the challenges that we faced in talking to women in Bangladesh had, we spent a lot of time talking to women and it had negative impacts on them because people were extremely suspicious of the fact that we were spending all this time talking to young women. Why on earth we were interested? It must be some nasty plot, to abduct women. And so there was a lot of pushback, and they stuck with it and supported this research for, what are we coming on to 9 years now, and following these women over a long time. So I just wanted to say that it's sort of very serious commitment to looking at these issues, and. So the cross-cutting, yeah, this is really hard. I think some of these, we have to understand what constrains women in different environments. Some of those things are the same, right? So mobility comes up again and again and again in many different contexts. Menstruation comes up. And so I think, it's great to hear that you're boiling down a good list to kind of 10 things that you want to, again, people do use the DHS as the thing that's across, but as you've heard, I have some concerns about it. So I think as a community, we're working on part of what's going to come out of this whole process is things that people find that work, where mobility is an issue, ask these kinds of questions. And as I said, one of the key things is about asking about being able to do something that women want. Now, exactly what, being able to say, travel to do something that women want to do. You could imagine asking that question that what women want to do may be different, but you could have some standardization, which is mobility to be able to do the thing that women want to do. And that's going to be different in different contexts, but there's some standardization. So that's maybe a kind of a bit of a halfway house. I also want to say that there's a difference between measurement for impact evaluation and measurement to just sort of assess the level of empowerment and women's opportunities in different contexts. That's a different exercise. And there you do want to be more standardized because you do want to ask about whether women are restricted during menstruation, even when they're not, because that's your point, is which countries does this apply to and which does it not? So there you want something more standard, and you want to ask questions even when women aren't constrained in that, because that's what you're trying to do. Whereas an impact evaluation survey has to be more tailored because you're looking at what this particular program has any hope of changing. So that's why we haven't talked about laws, because most of these impact evaluations aren't designed to change the laws, and therefore that's why they're not going to ask about them. But if you want to ask a cross-country question, then you do want to ask about laws. So that's why we haven't, not that the laws aren't important, although we all know there's a huge difference between the laws and what's actually happened. This big study with Save the Children I've been doing on child marriage, it's been illegal to marry below 18 for many years. It doesn't really change that much what's been happening on the ground. So, that's why we spend a lot of time asking about the things beyond laws. But we do a lot of work on norms. I mean, I think all of us have questions on norms in our surveys. We go across sectors in our surveys. We poll on behavioral change and health and education and economic empowerment. So I think we do a lot across sectors. Control, I think, is a really interesting question. And a lot of what we're getting at is about control of others, but how you ask about control is difficult, but that's definitely, one of the things that we're trying to get at. Who is controlling your behavior? But there may be better ways of asking about it.
Kate, you have.
Yeah, just quickly, I'll touch on the collective action question. It brings to mind for me a work that we're doing in Nigeria right now, where part of, again, our ground research was in understanding, it's a value chain project in rice. And we wanted to understand how to ensure that women take part in a value chain effort, because it's the same thing of cash crops, are going to be exclusive of women, and how do we not increase the amount of time that they are laboring but not gaining access to this income. And so, as I'm sure many of you know, in Nigeria, for example, men and women farm different plots of land, have control over different plots of land. Many of the women that we're working with are in polygamous marriages, and so they each have their own little plots of land. And we learned more about how they control that land, but also are required to work on their husband's land. And as part of that research to understand the context, we designed as part of our program a way to collectivize the women's labor on their individual plots of land across the polygamous relationships, so that no one man was able to kind of come in and control the decision making around that plot. help them to gain access to inputs jointly. And so they were farming jointly, and they all kind of could say, well, I can't control this. The other ladies are, part of the decision-making authority. And that kind of an intervention was obviously really informed by our efforts to understand where women have agency, where they already have control, and can help them to leverage that control to interact differently with their husband outside of this economic space even. So that's I think, kind of taking that back to how we measure that, I would be very interested. We haven't completed the work yet, but I would be really interested in using some of these non-survey instruments to apply to this context, to understand, observe a little bit what's going on with women, how are they making decisions, how are they talking with each other and talking with people outside of their collective group to understand, to take action around their plots and their incomes. I'll just reinforce, I think that standardization, both across measurement tools and across kind of what we are measuring, is challenging, as we've said. We've found that some of the standard tools, which is again why I'm excited about this, this approach to empowerment and measuring empowerment, some of the standard tools end up being very long, very onerous, and then end up creating a lot of information that we don't ever use. And so we apply the entire tool because that's the thing, and we don't know which questions are important because, again, we're generalists and we haven't done all of the background research. So we apply the entire tool. It takes 2 hours. The women are exhausted. It's more expensive, and then we only use 1 or 2 of the questions as a result. So I caution against seeking out that one standard approach because it tends not to kind of respond to. It tends not to get at the precise things that we could actually affect on.
Great coach. Let's get another round of questions.
Lola Hermosillo from USAID Peru, and I have a question, but a quick clarification. With regards to women's empowerment, I don't think this is a new buzzword. We've been talking about this since the 90s. I worked with a couple of microfinance organizations, and one of the objectives of microfinance, and I know it has evolved, has always been women's empowerment. My question is for implementing partners. When we as donors put out RFPs and women or gender dimensions are not clearly outlined, how can you help us think through like the role of women in some of our programs, right? Because that's one of the things that I struggle with. So, because a lot of people will say that, well, female empowerment was not one of the objectives, but we know that women are working in these spaces.
Any
Hi.
questions?
Hi, my name's Alyssa. I work for the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation. So I think one of the big things that we're talking about at my organization that I'm looking into is kind of women and the empowerment of their HIV status and being able to disclose it to doctors, to their family, to their partners, to kind of increase the amount of people that are getting tested, that are receiving treatment for HIV. So what kind of strategies do you have for empowering women, to discuss their HIV status, to talk about sex, to talk about drug use, to talk about all of these things, and kind of how a point where the empowerment for women can, override the stigma that kind of, prevents people from getting tested, from receiving the treatment that they need for HIV?
We'll take a third question.
Hi. Oh, okay. Is the mic working? Hello? My name is Sam. I'm an intern at New America. I'm working on a project at Brown University about pregnancy and contraceptive information in Zambia. And we're thinking about using a mobile app survey to collect our information. So my question is, how do you think employing technology will affect the data collection process? Do you think it will reduce social bias, or do you think it could have other problems? Thank you.
Great question. One more?
It's a good
one. One more. One more. Two more.
Hi, my name's Maeve Quigley. I'm the president and founder of World Design House. I own and manage a home decor company, and I'm directly sourcing from tribal artisans around the world. So it's a social enterprise. And the reason I'm here is because I'm really seeking to learn how to integrate gender empowerment into the indicators that I implement in my business. And I was wondering if you could maybe direct some specific resources that I could reference for building my own theory of change and simple indicators that I can integrate. I'm not a development agency, so something that's really practical would be helpful.
Right. The last question, and then we'll turn.
Hi, I'm Lauren Dammy. I'm from the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Child Labor, Forced Labor, and Human Trafficking. And thank you for a great talk, tool, and panel. We do a lot of studies, including a portfolio of impact evaluations that look at not only child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking, but vulnerability to child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking. And one of a concern that has been raised repeatedly in the past 10 years has been impacts, and you guys sort of started to touch on it, but impacts of the research itself on vulnerable groups. And so I was wondering if any of you have looked into, in your research, impacts of asking these questions on these women and girls after the research has been done, and this is something that we haven't explored that much within our office yet.
And you had a question. Let's take the last question. We may go over 5 minutes. But
my name is Samantha. I'm from Women for Women International. I'm interested in learning about time use surveys. I imagine it's very related to women's empowerment, but it's also really difficult to measure. And so I wanted to know if you had any best practices for measuring it, specifically with regard to understanding the household impact of household responsibilities on.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, shall we turn, Rachel, do you want to tackle?
Okay. So let me pick a few. This question of HIV and how do you get people to maybe reveal things that they're worried about socially within the community. There's some really interesting work going on about common knowledge, which is about maybe people are worried about saying things like, maybe people are worried about having their, the woman going outside to work, but maybe other people in the community actually are also feeling like they would like to do that, but the social pressures are that they shouldn't. So there's some interesting ways to try and get people together and maybe collect information about things that people would like to do but don't talk about because they're not, because they worry about the social pressure. And you get people to give that information privately, and then you only reveal it if, say, a third or half of people also agree. And then you reveal that actually, did you know, many of the other people in your community feel this way. And so you elicit the information privately, but then you reveal it, not individually, not that this person has HIV, but you reveal that people say, don't mind that their neighbor has HIV, or so if you get enough people in the community who have those views but are not talking about it publicly because they're worried about the reaction. So maybe I'm not explaining it very well, but there are a number of impact evaluations looking about whether this common knowledge approach of revealing that your neighbors know or care about things but are not talking about them because they're worried, but only if enough of them have that view, and whether that can change attitude. So it's still being tested, but it's something that I think is an interesting approach. On mobile surveys, so I didn't know whether you were talking about that people would do it on their mobile phones without an enumerator there, or whether you're talking about using technology in the field. So, and we first say using enumerators using technology has revolutionized impact evaluation in the last 5 or 10 years. It's so much easier to do it. You can do all sorts of tests. I have, when people are collecting data, There's a feature that it automatically switches on and records some aspects of it, which is a way of monitoring that the enumerators are doing what they're meant to be doing. You can GPS track the enumerators, all sorts of really cool things that using technology, but that's when you also have enumerators. Getting people to answer surveys on their mobile phones, really hard. So we did this during Ebola because in Sierra Leone, because it was obviously very dangerous for enumerators to go out and travel around the country, and they would sleep in local communities. That's what they do when they normally collect data. You don't want to do that in the middle of an Ebola outbreak. So we had, that was my main experience with doing mobile phone surveys. And the answer is they have to be really, really short, like 5 questions. You have to worry about you're not getting a representative sample. You have to worry about whether people understand the question. So it's really hard. It can work, but it has to be, you know, when you're like interested in a couple of questions. You know, we've talked about 2-hour surveys. 2 hours is probably a bit, you know, an hour and a half to 2 hours is what you normally do. 10 minutes, 5 minutes max when you're doing a mobile phone survey. Otherwise, people just stop. There are many other questions, but I'll let other people respond to them.
Ja, you want to?
So on the 2 hours, 2 hours and a half questionnaires, I think a good practice, just to keep us honest, is that we researchers actually do the survey, take the time and take those 2 hours to do the survey. So creating this empathy with the respondents is very important. Be sensitive to the burden of these questionnaires. So I'm very much a fan of short questionnaires, but then there is a trade-off. If you are too short, then you don't capture what you want. I think the mobile technologies to collect data can help solve some of the privacy issues that women might face answering sensitive questions. But then you could ask, well, what about is there a need to build a rapport between the enumerator and the respondent so that she feels confident and answer these questions? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think we're just scratching the surface of what we know about measuring empowerment. There's a lot to be learned, and these are all active areas of research.
Okay. Let's see, I feel like I have a couple that I really want to tick off. So I wanted to just acknowledge the question around the effects of, I'm not sure where it came from, but the effects of asking these research questions. Again, from an implementer's perspective, not only do we think about the effects of asking the research questions, but the effects of intending to empower women. We've definitely, thinking of some of our work with small businesses in Chile, some of our work in East Africa, so it goes across wide cultural differences. When we are working explicitly to empower women, we need to make sure that we are understanding the cascading effects of changing women's opinions about who they are and who they can be in society, and those effects, how those effects might be felt in the home. So one of the things that we've done, and I think this is also a good research practice, is to include men in the conversation around women's empowerment to the extent that we can. It may be in separate sessions, but it's nevertheless a discussion that we have. And to Rachel's point around HIV, but in this separate context, we often find that men are constrained too in their social roles. You know, men feel that they have a responsibility to gamble and play cards and drink coffee and and be with other men, and maybe they didn't want to do that. And to help them kind of break out and have those conversations about what their roles are has been actually effective in reducing domestic violence that has cropped up as an issue in some contexts when we're trying to empower women instead of not. Guidance to donors. I think that it's incumbent on practitioners when we see an RFP that is perhaps not fully vetted in a gender analysis. That's our work. That's what we need to do to be able to propose, and we should be really promoting that in our work to make it more inclusive and incorporated into our proposal. It's actually not easy though, and so the groundwork and a partnership with donors is really helpful so that we can, before an RFP comes out, start talking about some of these issues and have a kind of co-education process. I feel the pressure of time, so there are a couple of other questions that I wanted to answer, and I'm just not going to be able to.
Yes, we are 5 minutes over, but I just want to, on the time use question, data 2x with data 2x, we just did a methodology and policy review of time use studies. 88 countries have done them. They do them regularly. One big bottom line is they're completely underutilized for policy. So, and that gets to the question, a lot of the time, all this information is gathered and it's just not used. So anyway, thank you so much, everybody, for participating, and applause to Rachel and our family. I think it's really encouraging to see how the field is growing and we are learning, and I think we would just continue to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Myra.